Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or you're allowing your politics to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty magazine. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's the Associate Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us, and we're looking forward to having a great conversation. You know, in New York City, we have seen that the Attorney General there and others in leadership have decided that they wanted to put in place an initiative in their state civil rights bureau to address religious freedom violations. It's great to see that in New York State, which has a rich history of religious diversity, and they've also had a tradition of trying to make sure that they're doing things that support the Bill of Rights. But enshrined in that law, sometimes people do not get to actually serve their God the way they see fit. The Attorney General and other leaders in the state committed to protecting the history of religious tolerance and actually taking the power and putting it inside of the Civil Rights Bureau to address religious freedom violations and to aggressively enforce anti-discrimination laws. You know, Lawrence, you live in New York City, and when we see that we have a jurisdiction that not only talks the talk about trying to protect religious freedom, but deciding that they're going to actually put something inside of its Civil Rights Bureau to ensure that they are actually aggressively making sure that activities are not happening that are going to violate one's religious freedom. What does that say about a jurisdiction, and how difficult is it to make that stick?
Well, you know, I might sound like a biased New Yorker, but the reality is, if every place was New York, at least in this regard, it might be much less of a headache for those that work in this area. For example, and I've mentioned this before, but I'm always happy to do it again, New York's legislation dealing with the need for religious accommodation is so balanced and has such a long history of effectively doing what it's supposed to do that we long have wanted to see a federal statute mirror what happens here in New York in that regard, because it would make people's lives so much easier. But the fact is, New York didn't just wake up yesterday and decide that this was something that was important. Going all the way back, you can see where New York has made efforts to ensure that things like these are a part of the fabric of what happens here. Now, does that mean that we are a perfect state and get it right all the time? Well, I wish I could say that that's the case. Obviously, it's not. But it's very meaningful to know that people in leadership here have made an intentional effort to ensure that people's rights, especially in the area of religious liberty, are taken into consideration. And I really would urge other jurisdictions to be more proactive about dealing with issues like these, because everybody, and I mean everybody, benefits when efforts at fairness and accommodation are worked out across the board.
You know, Orlin, I appreciate Lawrence made the reference to the state level protections of religious people in the workplace and the accommodation level or standard that's set in New York law. And he made such a good point, and you did as well with your introduction, of how standards for religious accommodation in all sorts of areas, whether it's housing or employment or public accommodations, can vastly differ depending on the state that you live in. And so that's why I work along with many colleagues as part of a coalition of religious freedom advocates working towards federal comprehensive legislation in this space, because it really shouldn't matter if I live in Maryland or DC or Virginia as far as my religious freedom protections. And so I would love to see what's happening here or what's happening in New York take on a federal component.
You know, Bettina, I got a quick question. When we started to take a look at New York in comparison to other states, there was actually an index that was created, and you would think that you would be able to almost guess who would be at the top and who would be at the bottom. For example, in this index, it turned out that what one would call a red state, like Mississippi, was in first place, and what one would call a blue state, like Illinois, was in second place. And then you see a state like Texas, where you're not sure what's going on, and you would imagine that would be somewhere near the top. It turns out it's about 25th. In New York, what we were just talking about, end up ranking 50th at the bottom of the list. So on one hand, you've got all these great laws that are in place, but when people are on the outside looking in and trying to compare these jurisdictions, the rankings could actually cause you to wonder what on earth is really going on here.
What an interesting study this was that was released just recently, and ranking all the states according to certain criteria that the founders of the study identified. The problem is this: any study such as this, which tries to reduce the idea of religious freedom to a set of criteria, it's always going to be shaped by your starting assumptions of what actually falls into that religious freedom bucket. And so if you go to that study, to that index, you will see that there are a whole range of criteria are listed, ranging from, how far can a small business owner refuse to create a cake or a website for a same-sex union, So you ask yourself, is that religious freedom? Is that a criteria that we'd want to use? Another one is, can parents opt out of childhood vaccinations? Is that a religious freedom issue? And so there's about 10 different criteria there. And that's the problem with any study of this kind, which seeks such a simplistic, I guess, one-dimensional understanding of what religious freedom is. I mean, just take the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. One of the criteria was, does this state have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Well, there are different Religious Freedom Restoration Acts in different states,
right,
and some of them may have robust protections for church-state separation. Others may not, will actually diminish, the Establishment Clause protections. So, depending on how you define religious freedom is how you're going to understand this survey.
Andre, it seems like they say on a regular occasion that, it's all about the details, and the devil's in the numbers, and you can almost create a statistic or a set of circumstances to almost come up with whatever answer you want. I guess the bigger question is, there's been a lot of criticism that the Supreme Court has been pushing more cases back to the states in order for them to make decisions. But at the end of the day, sometimes we're looking like a confederation of states as it relates to certain laws, as opposed to the United States of America. And I'm wondering if this particular issue, as it relates to religious freedom, is something that we need, something that may be more global from a national perspective, as opposed to this kind of hodgepodge situation.
Yeah, we all think of religious liberty as a federal issue to be resolved by the judicial system, especially the Supreme Court. And this is a reasonable assumption because the First Amendment establishes a right to the free exercise of religion at the national level. But Tina's right. There really is no monolithic view of way to view religious liberty state to state. And what this study, this ranking by the Center for Religion and Culture and Democracy, the ranking of states, what it really does, it really makes you look at that there are differences in religious freedom protections that vary from state to state. But what it also reveals is that you can't make assumptions based on whether you live in a red state or a blue state. Like you mentioned, Mississippi's number one, but Illinois is number two. And then at the bottom of the list, you mentioned New York's 50. What's 49? West Virginia, a red state. And so these things are very you can't reduce them down to just a list of 8 or 10 criteria and buckets. But what this index does, though, I think what's useful about this is that it shows both citizens and lawmakers that there are some safeguards. There is legislation that's already in place, already possible, and already workable. And so lawmakers in these states, presumably that have more friendly religious liberty protections, should be able to pass legislation that is protective as other states. But if public hospitals in Connecticut are permitted to refuse to participate in abortion, then why can't a similar law be passed in Oklahoma, right? So I think that's what this list reveals.
Well, one thing it does also do, Lawrence, and this is interesting from New York's perspective, many times in the religious community, we are viewed as being reactive as opposed to being proactive. We wait for something to happen and then we react to it. One of the things you can say about New York here is for them actually going and measuring successes gives you a better idea on whether or not something is actively, proactively going on in the state, as opposed to waiting and just doing the data later on and figuring out that we're in a bad state and how do you turn things around at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, that's why when you have a list as subjective as the one that we just talked about, it's really ironic because I have lived here all my life and I've worked as an advocate for religious liberty since the late 90s. And so to see a list where New York is ranked last, you can imagine what would happen if you make a list and put at the top of the list a criteria that says how well you like Joe Biden or how well you like Donald Trump. Obviously, those numbers are going to skew wildly depending on where you are. The bottom line is this: having worked here as long as I have, I'm happy to say that New York has very robust protections and things that employers are allowed to get away with in other jurisdictions. It's not so easy for them to get away with here. And the fact that New York has been so balanced in its approach, because let's face it, as important as religious accommodation is, all of us have to admit that there are certain carved out places where if a person is not able to be available for Sabbath, the universe will blow up. And so you've got to be able to look at this thing from a fair standpoint to determine, well, here accommodation is possible, here is not so readily possible. And that's what I like about the approach that New York has taken. It asks the right questions and it takes the things into consideration that need to be taken in consideration. And nobody comes away from this process feeling like they've been beat up or unfairly handled. And that's why I really want to see federal level protection that mirrors what happens here, because no group can point at themselves and say, well, look at us, we've been disenfranchised by how things are done here. The history tells a very compelling story about how we operate.
But one of the things that's interesting is the fact that maybe the reason that many of the rules and regulations in New York aren't as codified is simply because they are in a jurisdiction where this whole idea of multi or ethnic or religious environments have been there for so long that they have figured out how to work some things together. And as many of our legislative leaders tell us, that the worst thing in the world is really trying to codify everything. And it looks as though there are a lot of issues that are already working properly there. And I guess it's still going back to the old saying, if it isn't broke, there's just no need to fix it. So we're going to let that be the last word on this segment. That state of New York has been really working on a lot of different activities. We talked about it being proactive in everything that it's been doing. But there was an interesting case which was called the Diocese of Albany versus Vullo. And in that particular case, we see New York State trying to deal with things from a financial services standpoint, mandating that employers will have to cover abortions and their employee health plans. And, in following all of this activity, we started realizing that there were some entities, in particular those that actually were engaged in some Anglican activities in the state, decided that this was a violation of their particular rights and privileges and wanted to make sure that the courts would come in and deal with it in a specific way. When you take a look at some of these particular rules of law that get created on a state-by-state basis, it makes it very difficult to really understand what we can do from a national basis. But New York tried to step in. They refused this particular presentation, and the legal groups had to come in and fight the fight, asking the Supreme Court to get involved to make sure that you can protect the rights of churches and ministries to teach and to serve without being forced to fund abortions. You know, Andrea, when you see a case like this, it kind of reminds us of some of the other cases that we've seen that have come down the road with Hobby Lobby and other particular sets of jurisdictions. But we're also been talking a lot about the fact that states believe they have the power to do certain things and should not, quote unquote, have the federal government imposing upon them. Supreme Court had a chance to deal with this particular issue as it related to New York. Can you give us a little bit of color of how this thing came into being and just give us an idea what that decision actually means?
Yeah, so this goes out all the way back to 2011 when the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services required employers to cover contraception treatment in their healthcare plans or face fines. And so legal challenges were made by religious institutions and businesses, and actually most famously an organization called Little Sisters of the Poor, an order of Catholic nuns who dedicate their lives to serving the elderly and the poor. And at that level, the Supreme Court 3 times ruled in favor of them, saying that if the government wanted to provide contraception, that it could not force the nuns into that position. So now we move up to 2017. Little Sisters of the Poor again are faced with the New York law that went a step further, requiring employers to cover actual abortions in their health plans. And again, here we go again. Now, Little Sisters of the Poor are litigating this. Initially, New York did plan to respect rights of conscience by exempting employers with religious objections, but the background is facing pressure from activists and others. The state just narrowed the exemption down to protect only religious entities with the purpose of inculcating religious values, and also only employed and served their own members. So the exemption was very narrow. But the bottom line is this: the law forced organizations of faith to violate their deeply held religious beliefs about healthcare and life.
Right, and exactly right, Orlin. And this is a case of deja vu. We've been here, we've covered this territory before, and it seems that we have to keep litigating this over and over again. As Andre pointed out, the issue at stake here is, how broad should those religious freedom protections be? Should they also cover institutions that aren't primarily engaged in a religious worship practice, inculcation, and so on? Can, for instance, a group engaged in elderly care, is that a religious organization that attracts these religious freedom protections? But I think the bottom line is clear. What public policy is served by forcing these religiously affiliated entities to contravene their own deeply held religious views? In Little Sisters of the Poor, the first time round, the court told the government to find a way that didn't involve the Little Sisters of the Poor in contraception. I hope that the courts will also tell the state of New York, find a way to serve your public policy goal without having this religious freedom violation.
But Lawrence, isn't the issue primarily, many of us have been engaged in the practice of law, and the one thing that we were always told is that if there's any change in the fact pattern, it's a whole new case. We keep telling ourselves that, we've been through this before. But we also understand that from a legal perspective, one change in a comma, one addition of a sentence, one change in any other fashion, and courts will look at it and say, completely different case. If that's going to be the analysis that we're going to be operating from, it's probably safe to say that we're going to have to keep litigating these matters over and over and over again, because that's just the nature of the law.
Listen, we never get to take a day off. And you all have to forgive me for feeling so mischievous. I completely understand the merits of the case, but I chuckled to myself as you made the intro, because I said the day nuns need contraception protection, we're all in trouble. But I understand that's not, that's not That's not what's going on there. I was just feeling a little mischievous. You have to forgive me. I'm sorry. But there's the other side to it, though. And I want to make sure that people understand you can only go but so far with some of those concerns. At the end of the day, if I work for you, healthcare is to cover my health, not yours. And I get it. I trust me, believe me when I tell you I get it. But you can only put but so fine a point on it. For example, we all aspire to healthy living. I'm part of a church that encourages total abstinence from things like alcohol and drug use. These are things that I preach. These are things that I actively encourage people not to engage in. But guess what? I work for the church. They pay me for doing what I do. And after all that encouragement, if I'm silly enough to take the money that I receive and go down to the liquor store to buy a bottle of Hennessy, the church can't say, we're going to pay you, but we're not going to pay you if you're using your money to buy liquor. I mean, obviously, if they find out I'm drinking, then I have a whole different problem. And, we'll probably have to find another line of work. But I'm making the point that you can have aspirations and you can have things that you want people to do or not do. But I just want to caution against trying to be so rigid in what we're calling for that we're not even going to cover a benefit. I may not believe in the benefit, but somebody else may be in a situation where they need the benefit. And I just feel that we have to be careful about how we draw these boxes.
Orlin, I might be getting a little jaded, but first of all, I have to say, if you're a constitutional lawyer or a judge, you certainly you have job security these days, right? Because with all of the very significant Supreme Court rulings that we've seen over the last year, there's all of these states that are testing limits, right? The last conversation, or the last segment that we had, we're talking about sort of on that religious freedom index, there was, a blue state next to the red state. That's not the situation that we're seeing as far as post-Dobbs ruling, right? And the conversation around abortion. And you see red states really pushing the limits as far as how restrictive they can be with abortion. And you're seeing blue states try to put in place protections to allow abortions or to require, in this situation, private employers to cover the healthcare cost of abortions. So I think that there is some political maneuvering going on here. I think one of the things, Andre talked about the religious exemptions that are involved and how those are quite narrow. But another exemption of this requirement, insurance requirement, is for self-insured plans. My understanding is that those are the plans that, for example, I work for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have a self-employed insurance plan program, right? Well, that's true for about 60% of New York residents or New Yorkers, that they fall under those categories. So the majority of those of New Yorkers are already, their healthcare program is already exempt from this. So I think that there is, some politicking going on here.
Well, I think when we look at these type of things, and Andre, I've got to get your thoughts on this. How do you look at a set of circumstances and potentially try to take the politics out of politics? The idea that somehow we've got legislation that can take place and it's not going to be, touched by politics in some form or fashion just seems to be something that's just an impossibility. And it almost feels as though you just got to be willing to wade through the muck of whatever the political agenda might be. And if you're lucky, you may get to the right result.
Yeah, we have politicized everything these days, and not only politicized, but weaponized and politicized issues. And I've mentioned on the show in the past that I was a candidate for the state legislature in 2010, 13 years ago. It is a completely different political landscape now. There is no way that I would be a candidate now with just the polarization and the vitriol that just comes with the territory. But when it comes to something, I would say as fundamental and basic as religious freedom, religious rights. The legal principle is this: that religious communities and individuals have the right to organize and operate according to their beliefs without the government discriminating among sincere religious beliefs. And so, I understand Lawrence's point about, it's not healthcare. It's healthcare for me. It's not healthcare for you. But when it comes to an organization where that's providing care, but yet there's a practice of care that goes against their own moral beliefs, and the way they view, the way they hold and view life. That's where the religious question comes in, and we have to wrestle with.
Well, I think as we wrestle with these questions, we're going to find out in the long run that the wrestling will never stop, because every set of circumstances is just a little bit different. Every state is just going to be a little bit different. And the prayer that many of us have had for a long time, well, let's just get it in front of the Supreme Court, because if we do, they'll settle it and it'll be clear. What we're starting to find out is if you get it in front of the Supreme Court, it's going to potentially even murkier when it's all said and done. So I think as we go forward, and I think we just have to hope that our churches will decide what makes the most sense. And you fight the fights when you have to, and you fight them because they're just simply worth fighting. Hey, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orland. So jumping back to the conversation we just had about the groups that are challenging the insurance requirements in New York, one of the challengers is a group of Anglican nuns who raise goats. Why do they raise goats, Orland? For their premium cashmere.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Melissa just stole my you don't know. But I have something extra to add. Did you know that one of those goats is named Rocky?
No, I didn't know that. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
If you go all the way back to the early days of the development of the New York State Constitution, even there, you will find intentional efforts being made to address the issues of religious freedom. And I take my hat off to this state.
Wow, Andre, tell me something I don't know.
New York is the only state that borders both the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes.
Did not know that. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us and providing us with this great information. Thanks again for being here with us as well. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.